Sean, Puerto Rican famous Figueroa. But we just call him famous because when he was in the 3rd grade, he won some contest to read a poem he wrote on the radio.
You want me to say that he deserved it? That fame was never built for this shit in the first place? I don't give a f about none of that. You only get one best friend in your life, and mine's is dead. That shit hurt and gonna stay hurt.
Now, we've been all wondering, where is Sean, famous Figueroa? Well, we found him. Famous is officially dead. He was found towards the end of the episode, body just dumped and left in a derelict building, waiting to be found. It really is a tragic end to Famous's story arc, Kanan's best friend. But now the question actually turns to, who killed Famous? Who did it? I think I've definitely got an inkling and you guys know who I'm referring to. The man who never misses an opportunity to miss an opportunity. I think Marvin being the one behind it causes all sorts of problems for Rock, Kanan, and also his relationship with Jukebox. But we're gonna run through it all, the clues, how Marvin could tie into this, the consequences, and the overall theme of pain, loss and loyalty, survival, grief, abuse, and of course the usual chess games. Because more so than ever, there are a lot of chess moves that are being made by various players to put themselves in a position of strength going forward. I do think the tables will eventually turn into Unique's favour, but we're gonna run through it all, the clues, and all the major talking points in all things Raising Kanan, Season 4, Episode 5, The Nail That Sticks Up. Now, this episode kicks off with a flashback of a younger Famous, Jessica, and Olga, Famous's moms. A few years ago, the Figueroa family used to live together. They used to be a family. Famous used to live with their pops, but he was someone who was very abusive, controlling, someone that would hurt you not just physically, but also scar you mentally. As sad as it is to say, people like this do actually exist. Kanan's narration started by rejecting the idea that memories like these aren't just a replay of events, but it's also tied to emotions. For someone like Famous, the abuse they suffered and also the escape would have left scars deeper than just physical pain, and sometimes that holds even more weight. Physical scars can heal, but what this does to you psychologically, now that's something Mrs. Figueroa, Famous, and Jessica would have to carry pretty much for their lifetime. Those are scars that just don't heal. But the fact it is actually Famous, Kanan's best friend, who was confirmed dead a bit later on, the narration hits even more, because this was also Kanan reflecting on how he feels the weight emotionally as well, especially when he found out Famous is gone. Feelings hit way harder than the other shit, because that's what memories is, a fucking feeling. Remembering come from your heart, not your head. And the fact that we have Kanan focusing on the heart, someone who really was heartless back in power, you could tell from this reaction, there was real pain, maybe even guilt at losing Famous. But the flashback is a real bad memory. Famous's mom's battered and bruised, scarred emotionally and physically. So in the night, she grabbed Jessica and Famous and fled to a shelter where there's no warmth. This isn't a home where you can make good memories, where good memories can keep you warm at night. This is the sort of shit that will grab you by your throat, which mirrors the brutal world that the Figueroa family grew up in and how they had to survive, not just physically but also mentally. As usual, Kanan's narration is raw, almost poetic, but this time at the beginning of episode 405, he's talking about the shift from heart versus head to remembering versus forgetting. And that also applies to Kanan, as it also did to Olga Figueroa.
But as hard as remembering can be, forgetting is way fucking harder.
Now, as we come back to the present day, we have Olga coming to meet Detective Garcia at the precinct. She's worried because Famous has been missing for 3 months. In 402, we learned that Famous had been missing for 2 months because when Detective Garcia rolled upon Kanan, he said nobody's seen him for 2 months. So a further month has passed as we begin episode 5, and we will talk about the timeline a bit later on. However, the last time we actually saw Famous alive was back in episode 310. He was picked up by law enforcement after Famous's mom handed in a gun that she found in his cupboard. The gun was linked to Freddie Williams' murder, and law enforcement had him pretty much dead to rights. In hindsight, she probably wishes she didn't, because he's not been seen since. Now, from Detective Garcia's point of view, he was a wanted fugitive on the run, but Olga doesn't see it that way. She did actually confirm he was actually talking to law enforcement. He was telling them what they wanted to know. So we have our confirmation, Famous was being cooperative, although we don't know exactly what he told Detective Garcia, and whether he'd be able to use that information anyway, because Garcia hasn't really made much headway in his case for months. But this is where he mentioned she may want to go and speak to Kanan Stark. He was Famous's best friend, who was into a whole lot of bad shit, because the oldest friends have the deepest scars. So definitely keep that quote in the back of your minds. We're definitely going to come back around to it right at the end. Now with Marvin and Rock, we pick up with them having a real issue with David and Terry. After Unique and Damon hit the transportation of Rock's product, which is run by Terry's transportation company in 404, he's caused a huge problem for Rock. I think Unique's point of view is he's just making any move he can. He definitely wants to break Rock piece by piece, as we learned a bit later on with his conversation with Phil Russo. But I don't believe there's any real thought process behind his hits. He's just gunning for everyone and anything he can, causing absolute chaos and mayhem. And it really is a headache for Rock. She's got products sitting on the shelves at the warehouse, collecting dust. That means the product isn't moving to the Chinese restaurants, and the eventual knock-on effect will be on sales, your cash flow. You're going to end up losing customers, because addicts will get their fix regardless. They'll always find a way to get their high. So they needed to deal with Terry and David. Now this is also where she updated Marvin about Andre Barnes' death. How law enforcement came over in episode 404. They were tracing his footsteps and came to see Rock, and both of them acknowledged that Andre got them out of a whole lot of shit, and he definitely did. But he was more. He was the person with all the connections to law enforcement. So while we're on her and Marvin, let's remember he did warn Rock in 402. Law enforcement did see Marvin with Stefano Marchetti, something that's still continuing in 405 behind Rock's back. Marvin's mistakes are piling up, and he really is digging himself a big hole. So let's talk about another. They both came to see David a bit later on, where they learned Terry pressed the pause button on moving Rock's product because he's scared. Now Marvin could slap David around all day long, but they weren't going to make any headway with David. Terry was actually the man in charge of this operation, and they needed him to play ball. So Rock made it clear to Marvin he needs to go hard, but not too hard. They still needed to work with him after he was done being the hammer. So he had to find the right balance. Lo and behold, what did Marvin go and do when he paid Terry a visit later on? Terry had enough. He said he was done taking orders from Marvin and Rock, and as far as he was concerned, their business relationship was over. He wanted nothing to do with this marriage with Rock, so to speak. But his big mistake was the fact he threatened to go to law enforcement. That was a huge mistake. Once you make that threat, especially to someone like Marvin, it's game over. We know from day one Marvin hates snitches. You go back to the time where he actually gave Sam the crackhead the benefit of the doubt. He gave him some cash to leave New York, but he didn't. When the stash house got hit in season 1, even though Rock wasn't bothered, he still wanted to smoke the rat. Again, in season 2, you go back to the whole Tony Deep situation. He wanted to exterminate the rat. So when you think about Marvin making all these moves, the fact that he hates snitches, it only fuels the theory of him being the one to get rid of Famous even more. But down went Terry, and Rock is definitely going to be fuming. I think if Rock was handling this situation, she would have dealt with it very different, just like she did with Erwin. Sometimes when Rock gets up to your face, she doesn't need a gun. Best believe, you are going to hear her loud and clear. But definitely another mistake from Marvin. With that being said, let's move on to the aftermath of another from 404. Now, towards the end of 404, we saw Marvin going over to Mara's husband's apartment, getting into a tussle where he needed to be saved by Duke. It ended with the death of Aaron and Duke getting her first kill. So, we pick up with Mara telling Jukebox, law enforcement do think it was a home invasion. Someone forced their way in, things went sideways and they killed Aaron. However, she asked if Duke had anything to do with it, because she did give her the apartment address. Of course, Duke was always going to deny being involved, and I think the fact that Mara's head was all over the place, but at the same time, actually relieved he was finally gone. She's not thinking too deep into it. Aaron was most likely another abuser, just like the Figueroas had to deal with, so she was just relieved. Like I mentioned before when we broke down the flashback, abusers don't just wear you down physically, but they also wear you down mentally. Sometimes you don't even know they're doing it. Now, we know Marvin is a real tough guy, but Aaron really did catch him pretty bad when he turned his back. It showed that Marvin is actually human, and sometimes you can get caught. Even the toughest of soldiers in the streets, if they're not careful, they will get caught.
I've been stabbed twice. I'd rather get shot.
In Power, we've even learned Tommy Egan's been stabbed. That was in conversation with Ruiz. But he raised a topic of what Duke did at the end of 404. He questioned whether she was sleeping well, because doing what Duke did, that really can eat you up. We saw Famous's reaction to killing Freddy. He was someone who really struggled, but Duke was good. Law enforcement think it was a robbery, but when Marvin said the army's got you comfortable killing people, Duke mentioned, if she's comfortable with it, it isn't because of what she went through in the army. It's because of all the death that Duke has seen, all the pain that she's been through, all the people that she's lost from Nicole, Detective Shannon Beck, who had a soft spot for Duke, the trauma with Kenya, and then later she passed in episode 210. She also knows who her family are, what they're capable of. She once told Kanan back in season 1, there are secrets about their family he doesn't know. Well, one of them was D-Wiz. She saw D-Wiz get into the car with Lou the night he was murdered, something Kanan only found out a bit later on. Duke has been around a lot of death, seen a lot of death, and felt a lot of pain, and it gets to a point where it just stops hurting, because just like Kanan's narration said at the end of 404.
And them's the motherfuckers you gotta fear the most, cause they dead already. They just don't know it yet.
Now from the older Kanan back to the younger Kanan, we catch up with him where it's business as usual. He's asking OC whether the streets are talking, because he still needs to find out who robbed them. Obviously at this moment in time, even we as the audience had no idea. OC was now feeding information to Unique, but Kanan needs to find out because he really does need to put down a big marker. Snaps and Pop told him in 404, at this moment in time, he looks vulnerable. He can't just let himself get robbed and let it go unanswered. How does he want people to see him in the streets? I'm sure he wants to be feared and respected. So at the back of Kanan's mind, he definitely hasn't forgotten. He still wants to deal with whoever robbed them. However, this is also where we learned he is skimming off the top. We saw him heading over to a storage unit where he's now keeping his cash, making sure he wasn't followed. He's taking all the precautionary measures after the last time. Now I asked a question earlier this week, which I thought was a very valid question. Can Rock trust Kanan? I really don't think she can, and this only further proves that point. Kanan's still making a few moves behind Rock. We saw him meeting Quan and also meeting Stefano, and I think this is only scratching the surface in terms of Kanan going behind Rock's back or fully turning against her. I think the final straw would genuinely be if he found out Rock had something to do with Famous's death, but it definitely is going to be something we are going to be going into in a lot more detail this coming week. But speaking of Famous's death, we also had Kanan and Jukebox coming over to see Famous's moms. She was really worried, in tears. She had no idea what to do apart from question Kanan, because that's what Detective Garcia said, although we know law enforcement just love to stir trouble. Now Kanan mentioned the streets have been talking, Famous bounced on his own, but they didn't believe it. Famous would never bounce without telling them. We know Kanan was thinking the worst when it came to Famous, because that's what he said in conversation with Lou back in 404. They know he's not in LA out with Jessica, and the vibe that we've been getting over the last couple of episodes was that Famous was out of here. From the conversation between Marvin and Lou back in 402, the conversation between Lou and B-Rilla, the conversation between Lou and also Imani Okoye in 404, it was just a question of when were they going to reveal it. But they did make a promise to Famous's moms. If anything did happen to Famous, they're going to find them and they're going to make it right. Again, coming back around to the Marvin theory, if it does prove to be Marvin, then it really does make things complex for the entire Thomases, including Duke. But this is where we saw yet another flashback with a young Famous. It seems like Famous has a history of hiding things in his cupboard. When he was a kid, he found a stray dog that he brought home, which he hid. And it also lines up as to why his moms probably looked through his cupboard back in 307. As I've been mentioning throughout season 4, history always rhymes. But in this flashback, she told him that she is happy to let him keep this dog. These memories were good memories, but also hurting Olga at the same time. And you could really see where they were taking this story. They were just building up to a heartbreaking reveal. They were just getting us ready. Now, Kanan and Jukebox actually had to bounce from Famous's because Grandma Joyce Thomas had a fall. She needed to go to the hospital, but she was being very stubborn, as elders sometimes normally are. I also mentioned before, this definitely is something that often happens to grandparents as they start to get older. I've seen it with both of my grandparents, where they become forgetful, where they have falls, dislocate something, or hurt something. They don't recover as easy as us kids do. So I really like the fact that they're taking time with Joyce Thomas's death, which we know is definitely coming, but they're showing us the process. She's deteriorating over the span of a few months. It's not something that they've thrown in and an episode later, she's gone. Joyce Thomas's death is definitely going to hurt, and we're definitely going to come to why a bit later on, especially for Rock. But speaking of Rock, while this was happening, Rock had a meeting with Quan. After he raised his prices by 20% in 402, this business relationship has been a ticking time bomb ever since. And we know Rock. We've seen it before when she came face to face with the Italians. Rock is someone who plays by her own rules. She's not always the easiest to deal with. Another example was how she moved her people into the empty territory back in season 1. She said post deals weren't her deals. She's not always been the easiest to deal with, which is why Quan mentioned he isn't happy with the way Rock conducts business. She's messy. There's death in the streets, too much noise in Queens. And if we were to take it back to season 1 again, that's the reason why Dean pressed pause on their partnership. He was someone who liked to stay off law enforcement's radar, keep it simple, keep it quiet. This is also where he mentioned how he had respect for Unique and poked her with Kanan coming to visit him. Kwon said he hopes that she makes a better mother than she does at business, and that definitely didn't go down well at all. Their business relationship is over. Rock doesn't beg or kneel for no man. She made it clear to Unique in season 1, and even towards the end of season 2 when she was looking down the barrel of a gun, she wasn't afraid. She wasn't gonna beg. She said, do what you came here to do. So this battle with Kwon, it definitely is gonna get a little feisty, especially with what we saw towards the end. Now this is where Rock also got a pager, which I believe would have been from Kanan and Jukebox. However, she ignored it. Something I do think Rock will live to regret a bit later on. I think there are a lot of things that need to be said between Joyce and Rock. They need to finish this conversation that they had in 404. But with Rock being so fixated on her crumbling empire, she's not even thinking about Joyce. I think when she does, it's going to be way too late. Joyce is probably going to be gone. And maybe that's why we're going to see her in tears a bit later on. I do think it's going to be way too late for Rock when she realizes, even though Rock is really tough, I do think Joyce's death is going to hit her the hardest. Now in the meantime, she did go and see Hafiz. She really did need to move quick, because she has just lost her connect. But before he agrees to anything, he said he needed to speak to her other partners, because the territory of Queens was already spoken for. He didn't want to enter the Devil's Playground. He also mentioned Rock spoke like someone who's been betrayed before. She moves like someone who's been betrayed. And that's because she knows more than anyone. There are no friends in the streets. She knows she can't even trust her son. So who can she trust? Now, over at the hospital, we had Kanan, Jukebox, and Lou coming over. The doctor mentioned Joyce's condition has worsened, and she will need round-the-clock care. A bit later on, we also saw Marvin come over. He was making sure she was tucked in, making sure she was comfortable, making sure she was getting enough fluids. But this is where Joyce asked something of Marvin, which I think put Marvin in a really difficult position. She was asking him to do her a favour, save her from all the suffering, from all this pain. Just put her to sleep one more time, once and for all. Again, why it's so relatable is because I've seen it both with my grandparents. It's not nice to see, but sometimes elderly people get to a position where the pain is just too much, and where they'd probably just rather go. They feel as if they're becoming a burden on their kids, because they need round-the-clock care. They can barely take 2 steps. They need assistance when they need to go to the restroom, or when they want to shower. It really is difficult. But the thing that Joyce was asking Marvin to do, I mean, just how? She could shout he was a coward all she wanted, but it really wasn't going to change Marvin's mind. He just couldn't bring himself to do it. I don't think anybody could bring themselves to do it. Definitely not Lou. And speaking of Lou, let's actually move on to what he was up to in episode 5. Now in 404, Lou wasn't happy at the fact he was having to work with Imani Okoye, but sometimes in business, you do have to work as a team, and we saw Lou mentioning he will give it a go. They went to scout a few different artists, where they came across a group called Drawdown Disciples, and these guys were actually lit. We saw Lou agreeing, and so did Imani Okoye, so they might just find themselves being signed up to their record label. Later on, Imani did mention Drawdown's manager was happy to sit down with them, but in terms of the white kid that Lou took a liking to, that's going to be proved to be a bit more tricky, because his mom is a big shot lawyer over at a firm called Sinclair. She said it was a pretty serious firm, and we know they don't drop these hints for no reason. I do think Lou really did take a liking to this particular kid, and he will want to bring him on board, so definitely one to just keep in mind. Now earlier in the week, I did speak about something we did need to keep an eye on, and that was whether Imani Okoye or Jackie could be trusted. Could they be planted as CI's confidential informants? Jackie was nowhere to be seen in 405, maybe she'll return in 406, but we did see Lou sleeping with Imani a bit later on, but that's not what I want to focus on. This is where she asked about him being with Famous's sister Jessica. She's been doing a lot of research on Lou, and it just keeps the question open in terms of, can she really be trusted? Why is she digging into Lou's personal life? If we were to go by a recent example, something we actually saw in Force Season 1, there was actually a journalist who was sleeping with Diamond. I'm not going to say Imani Okoye is an informant just yet, but definitely keep that option open. She is a bit sus. But let's move on to all things Unique. Now with Unique, he's still making sure he keeps himself a bit hidden, but also making sure he takes care of Panessa and Jerome. Over the last few months, we've seen him leave a lot of money for Panessa. From Panessa's point of view, she has no idea it's Sneak. She thinks he's dead, and it's actually Rock who's leaving her the cash. She thinks Rock's feeling guilty for killing Unique, and that's why she's leaving her money in her mailbox. Now, we as the audience know it isn't Rock. We also know as the audience, Unique doesn't have too many people left either. I mean, who's around that would look after Panessa? I do think Rock should have questioned it and thought, who could actually be leaving her money? But the thing is, Unique would never spring to mind because they all believe he's dead. It's actually been more than a few months since we saw this moment in 305. 3 months passed between 305 to 310. We know a further 2 months passed up to episode 402. And as we bring ourselves back up to speed up to episode 5, another month has also passed. So you're talking a total of 6 months. That's a hell of a long time for Unique to be away, for someone to be in their own thoughts, coming up with their own version of events, and staying low. Now towards the end of 404, Teresa Boselli did give Unique a piece of paper, a contact that might be able to help him, who turns out to be New Jersey's new crime boss, Phil Russo. Just as a reminder, his character description that was given to us before season 4, it reads, he's New Jersey's new crime boss, accustomed to garnering respect, deference, and other men's fear. He suffers no fools, and handles business negotiations with stoic confidence, and I think that's exactly what we saw from him in 405. It's a perfect matchup to his description. However, Unique was here because he does need a new alliance. He knows he's not strong enough at this moment in time, and he also knows Phil Russo may have a bone to pick with Rock and also Stefano Marchetti, especially with them being behind Sal Boselli's hit. He wants to break Rock piece by piece, but with her being backed by Stefano, it really is difficult for Unique to get anywhere near her. He can continue hitting her operation as he has been, but how long can he do that for? Now this is where Phil Russo actually mentioned he hadn't heard anything about Rock being the one who tried to whack Unique. That's something he would have definitely heard. He's got eyes and ears everywhere in the streets. But it actually goes back to the point around how long Unique's actually been gone for. 6 months. He's been laying low for 6 months. He's been running with his own version of events, seeing things from a different lens, seeing things from the wrong lens, in terms of Phil Russo backing him. He did mention he's already had a few opportunities already. So until he shows he can build a real organisation, there was nothing further to discuss. But I do suspect Unique will be back in a much stronger position, because Phil Russo will want to take Stefano Marchetti on. And why not use Unique and his crew? Why not use them as pawns? These Italians definitely won't get their own hands dirty. These mafia guys also love stabbing each other in the back, always finding loopholes to turn on each other. Just like Hafiz said to Rock, the bloodiest wars are fought over territory. You go back to the history books. If a king wanted to take over someone else's land, they go there and fight for it. Blood will be shed. With the Italians, Phil Russo and Stefano Marchetti, they're the kind of guys to just sit back with cigars in their hands while they let everyone else fight their battles. So now that Phil Russo has entered the picture, we are going to see Unique starting to make a few more chess moves, a few more smarter chess moves. So, speaking of good chess moves, this was one of them. He's got OC infiltrated in Kanan's organisation. He needs to know what's going on inside of Rock's organisation, just like Rock tried to plant Scrappy into Unique's back in season 1. Well, this is Unique turning the table, and as Detective Howard once told us, to get to the Queen, sometimes you have to go through the Prince. OC told him about how Kanan was skimming off the top, and also how Rock has beef with Quan because of a price increase. That made Unique think, if Rock's got beef with Quan, then that's another alliance I can potentially make. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And we all heard what Quan said earlier on to Rock. He had a lot of respect for Unique when they did business back in season 3, even though Unique's organisation didn't quite take off. So, how I mentioned this week there's a big chess game that's unfolding in Raising Kanan season 4. This is why. Everyone's making moves to put themselves in a position of power and strength, none more so than Unique. There's a potential alliance with Phil Russo, and now Quan. And adding the fact that OC is also infiltrated within Kanan's organisation, all of a sudden, Unique is looking really strong. The next step is to put his crew together and go back to Phil Russo. But let's move on to arguably the moment of episode 405, that's Famous's death. Now we do have a kid who doesn't actually have a name on the show. I did definitely check the end credits. This kid is actually played by Casey Cameron. He's been posting all about it on social media, but there is definitely no name in the end credits. It just says Wiry Kid. He steals a drink from the bodega and ends up being chased by the owner. He gives him the runaround and both of them find themselves inside a derelict building where they see a body under a mattress. And this is of course what they've been building up to all episode long. Sean Famous Figueroa is gone. Detective Garcia mentioned they found his ID on him. They haven't done the dental checks, but this is Famous. The fact that Olga had this reaction when they brought his body out definitely tells us everything we need to know. Famous is gone. And now the question actually turns to who killed Famous. I've already had my suspicions from day one. We've been through it a few times in this particular breakdown, and that's Marvin Thomas. I do think Marvin did kill him, and they will eventually show it in a flashback. I do think they have to. But as they come to Kanan's reaction, you could tell this is something that really did hit him hard. His narration had all the themes of irreplaceable loss, which is why he'll probably later name his son Sean, but it had the themes of irreplaceable loss, grief, and futility of the game. Fame was never built for this shit. Duke and Kanan said it back in season 1. This is the shit D-Wiz was built for. Some don't make it no matter how strong they are, and this really is a big moment in Kanan's story arc. Losing Famous, his best friend, it really is gonna hurt. We can see how much pain he's in, but he definitely is gonna bury that pain. It's gonna harden him. It's gonna toughen him up. It's gonna make him even more ruthless. And it also ties back to the saying from Garcia, old friends have the deepest of scars. Famous's death is the deepest cut that Kanan has had so far, but there definitely will be more.